Dirk, begin ik direct?
En je bent nu live, als ik het goed heb.
Goedemiddag allemaal. Niet van Nieuwpoort het zomerweekend, maar vanuit Deurne aan één kant, Londen en op de verschillende plaatsen waar de verschillende mensen zitten. Live bij jullie voor het digitale zomerweekend van Groen. Hier is het heel hard aan het regenen, dus het is gezellig achter het scherm. Helaas kan ik niet lang bij jullie blijven, omdat ik omwille van verschillende agendaproblemen helaas niet de hele sessie kan blijven. Maar ik wilde toch de introductie doen. And to everyone who is watching, I am very proud to introduce the next speaker, who is none other than Carolyn Steel. It is a big honor for us because Ms. Steel is a widely acknowledged and respected thinker on how food production and consumption both shape our lives and our world. It's one of the basic necessities for humanity, and many of us have read as Greens her bestseller The Hungry City, a book on the relationship between food and cities. And in the cities where we as Greens are present, we try to implement a lot of the insights in our policy every day. Thank you, Ms. Steele, for being here amongst us today. Your presentation illuminates an issue that is fundamental to each and every one of us. I can say that food and water is essential for every life on this planet. And the question how we can feed ourselves with respect to the boundaries of this planet, of people, of animals and nature is very important. And your recent book, Citopia, I hope I pronounced it correctly. That's the one you will be presenting us today. Once more explores the way in which modern food production has damaged that balance of human existence and reveals that we have yet to resolve a centuries-old dilemma that holds the key, if I could say, to a host of current problems that we are experiencing right now, from obesity and the inexorable rise of the supermarkets, where the link with food is not always that easy, to destruction of our natural world. This disconnection on how food is produced and the way it is presented to us and where it comes from also is a part, I think, of the alienation with the natural environment in which we live. And as Greens, we have always argued in favor of safe, healthy, sustainable food, but also food that is accessible all over the world to everyone. We know that the production of food exceeds the necessity of food, that we can feed easily everyone in this world, but we see at the same time that a lot of this produced food is then lost, thrown away, that it's one of the biggest pollution problems in our world. And at the same time, you have this obesity and an enormous amount of people who are still starving, if you look at it in numbers, in actual numbers, the biggest because our population has risen over the centuries. So food that is accessible to all, big issue. And as an ecologist party, you have a Green Party also in the UK. We want to take back control of our food, the way it is produced, the way it is presented to us, the way we have a relationship with it, and the way we consume it. And if we want to take back control of the food, it's for us also a means to take back control of an important part of our life and of our health as human beings. So this also requires a food policy that is sustainable, and that's where politics comes in, and what we do every day at the different levels, from the smallest community to the highest European level, if I may say. And Petra is here also today. It requires a food policy that is sustainable from an economical perspective. Farmers, for instance, who deserve just better prices for the crops that they produce. They need a decent income that allows them to make a living out of it. And while we had a cloud break here in Deurne today, normally we are at the seaside with our summer festival as a party. We know that for the last weeks, the crop growers in West Vlaanderen have been suffering because of enormous shortages of water. And we know that farmers who maybe until a few years weren't really involved in the question of ecology or everything that has to do with climate change are now becoming on the front of the battle against climate change, and the ones who are experiencing in real time what the climate crisis is bringing us here in Belgium. And we know that there are fires in California. We know that there are a lot of things going on everywhere in the world, but it sometimes seems so distant. The floods in India. And yes, we know that our climate might be heftier or more with more extreme weather patterns amongst us, but it still doesn't seem as bad as what's happening in the rest of the world. But if you look at the people who are working with the soil, working in the earth, they know, they see, they feel the erosion, the shortage of nutrients, of water. They see what's going on, the pollution. And so it is a real honor and to have you here today to enlighten us, to have this conversation with us. We are thrilled to have you among us, I might say, for everyone who is watching this. Your ideas and certainly also your enthusiasm will surely be an inspiration to us all. Unfortunately, as I told you earlier, and everyone who was listening, I told it also in Dutch, I cannot attend the presentation due to the current political situation. As you know, in Belgium too, everywhere around Europe and in the world, it is not so easy, but we are trying to fight for solutions that are sustainable in every way. So therefore, unfortunately, I was called away today. I cannot stay, but this will be recorded so I can look at it later. And you are in the really experienced hands of Dirk Holemans from Oikos, who is an expert, who has also read your book, from Petra, our European parliamentarian. I was looking for or MP. That's the easiest word. And Chris Steenwegen, who has worked for decades in an environmental. How do you call it, Dirk? Natuurpunt, Nature Point. It is literally translated, but it's a big movement of a lot of volunteers working around the environment in Belgium and buying a lot of green areas so they can take care of it in a sustainable way. It is a real project of a lot of people with a heart for nature and environment. He has been working there, and now he's in Flemish Parliament for us. They will have the conversation with you. Once again, it really breaks my heart that I cannot take part, but who knows, maybe in better days, in real life, we will be able to meet. It is an honor and a privilege.
Well, thank you very much, Meyrem, for that lovely introduction. And I'm sorry you can't stay as well, but politics calls. Yes. And I look forward, maybe if you can watch the recording, then maybe we can have a chat about it later. And certainly, I hope next year it will be possible to meet in person, which would be
well, that is a promise. We will.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you. And my greetings to everyone there in London who is watching and maybe following us as well. Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So please, Carolyn, you have the floor.
Right, off I go. Fantastic. Right. Well, I am going to try to address all of the issues that Meyrem just discussed at some length, actually. So let me just go to sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see this now. And hopefully you can still hear me as well. All good?
All good.
Okay, excellent. we're going live. Fantastic. Yes, I mean, essentially, absolutely, as Meyrem just said in her introduction, food is a phenomenally complex force, if you like, that really shapes our lives and world. And I often say it's too big to see because really it's everywhere in our lives. And maybe my favorite example of the phenomenon that is the way food shapes our lives is this amazing fresco by Lorenzetti. And it's called The Allegory of the Effects of Good Government, rather appropriately. And I don't know whether some of you know it, but it basically sits on one side of the town hall building in Siena, the main town hall meeting room in the Italian city of Siena. And it's about 25 meters long. It's really, really huge, huge image. And basically, as you can see here, it shows on the one hand, the city of Siena, and on the other hand, the countryside that feeds it. Can you all still hear me? Okay. Everyone can hear, good. And what's very striking about it, I remember seeing this image when I was an architecture student on my sort of grand tour of Europe, as it were. And I was very struck by this red wall splitting the image. And it looked very strange to me at the time, but it didn't really occur to me that what that wall is actually a membrane. And it's connecting two essential halves of something that was a whole, and the whole was the city-state of Siena. So rather than being a barrier, it's actually just a sort of delineation of two different halves of the same thing. As I say, you can see people and objects traveling through it the whole time. So we have huntsmen leaving the city, maybe to go and shoot a boar or a deer or something. We have a road coming from the port, winding up, with asses with grain on their backs, a pig walking into the city. And outside we have, again, asses bringing grain into the city, a flock of sheep wandering around, a woman with a basket of eggs on her head, another one carrying a chicken, and so on. So when you look closely, you see that this image is really about a relationship, an essential relationship between the city and the countryside. I'm going to have to shut my window, they're drilling outside, sorry. They always start drilling when you talk. This is the new world of Zoom. Yes, so it shows the essential relationship at the heart of urban civilization. And basically the city councillors who would have sat in this room many years ago, they would have taken a very strong message from this image, which is basically, the city needs to look after the countryside, and the countryside looks after the city. And it's interesting then if you revisit the title of the fresco, which is The Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. It says everything. And once you understand that this image is really all about food, it then becomes quite puzzling why every city hall in the world doesn't have a similar image on its wall. Now at the bottom of this, I've said, what is a good life? And I think ultimately, that's the question that this fresco asks. It's a fresco that attempts to ask a big question, which is basically, what does an ideal world look like in a way? It's a kind of utopia. And even though in the 14th century, city-states like this did absolutely find an unusual balance between city and country, it's also about, how should we behave? How should we find balance in our lives in order to thrive? An ultimate political question, if you like, with food at its heart. Now, as I say, as soon as you understand what this image is really about, it becomes slightly puzzling that we don't see this image everywhere. And I think there are many reasons for this, one of which is, as I say, that the Italian city-state was a very brief moment in history when there was actually quite a good balance between the city and the countryside. Often it hasn't been quite this stable. And of course, today, very often, this is my home city of London on the left, and very often we're fed by landscapes that aren't just outside the window. If you go to the city of Siena now and look outside the window, you can still see a landscape very much like the one in the fresco. But of course, many of the landscapes that feed us today are thousands of miles away, and they're kind of weird, denatured places like this that you wouldn't necessarily choose to paint on a wall anyway. So food has become distanced from us, both physically and mentally. And it's part of what I call the urban paradox. And the urban paradox is the fact that most of us live in cities globally now. We think of ourselves as urban, we talk of ourselves as urban, but actually, because we're animals and we need food to sustain us, we actually dwell in a more real sense in nature. And the paradox that we have these dual needs, one for society and one for nature. And the more we gather together in cities in order to satisfy the social side of our needs, if you like, the further away we get from our sources of sustenance. And of course, the whole relationship between the city and the countryside has been brought into question by COVID, which is something I'm going to address a little bit later on. Now, up until recently, you could have been forgiven for thinking that this distancing of the food system and the fact that our food comes from a long way away was fine. Most of us, just wander into a supermarket. This is actually one in America, if you like, the land of plenty, sort of writ large. And it would never occur to you that there was any problem with the way we eat, because just look at all this wonderful bounty all around us. And I think that's why when this happened at the beginning of lockdown a few months ago, it was deeply, deeply shocking for a lot of people. Nobody had seen anything like this before. This is actually my local supermarket in London. And even someone who studied the food system for 20 years, was surprised to see this sort of, the rapidity with which food began to run out. And we also began to see signs of quite bad behavior. In the UK, there were stories about grown men wrestling grannies to the ground for the last tin of baked beans and so on. So, people started behaving pretty badly pretty quickly. But what it actually spoke of is a fragility in the food system that I think many people didn't realize was there. And this is quite significant. It goes back to, as Meyrem said in her introduction, it goes back to really the oldest question facing humans, which is the question of how to eat. Now, all living creatures face this question, but they don't necessarily do it consciously. So trees have to eat and beavers have to eat, but they just kind of get on with it. We're the only species for whom this has become a kind of conscious problem, as it were. But it's also the fact that it has become conscious and that we realize that it's a shared problem has actually, in many ways, given rise to civilization. I could talk endlessly about this picture because for me, it really sums up something fundamental about us, which is that the discovery of various technologies through our history, and in particular the control of fire, have all been game changers. Now, the control of fire, which, if you like, this represents, changed many things. In a sense, it gave us a place, a home that we could make in the landscape. The hearth, if you like, became the focus. The Latin word for fire is focus. It became the focus of our society. Crucially and practically, it allowed us to start cooking food. Now, cooked food has a big advantage over uncooked food in that you can absorb the calories from it much, much quicker. And it's allowed our ancestors to start specializing in hunting, because hunting is a rather precarious way of eating, because, you go off into the forest and you try to catch an animal, but you might not succeed. So if you don't succeed, you won't have any food to eat that day. And our ancestors solved this problem by coming up with what effectively is the first social contract in human history, which is basically you hunt, I cook. So the men would go off to hunt, and meanwhile the woman would gather tubers nearby and cook them on the fire. And then if the hunters weren't successful in the evening, the band still had something to eat. And this allowed us, as I say, to specialize in hunting because there was a backup plan. And you could say that, sort of our domestic arrangements haven't changed much ever since, in that the woman's role of staying home and kind of cooking the evening meal has kind of remained very firmly entrenched in many cultures globally. But very interestingly, this division of labor leading to different kinds of food, so meat on the one hand and cooked tubers on the other, also became the material with which people invented the oldest, and again, in my view, the best ever invented economy, and that is the shared meal. So basically, at the end of the day, the band gathers and whatever people have managed to produce in the way of food is shared out equitably. And it's a beautiful model. We evolved through the sharing of food. We're very, very good at it. We're, again, the only animal species that does it in this way consciously. And again, it's almost a critical moment in our history that we learned to do this. Now, how we eat, how we solve the problem of eating also has a profound effect on the kinds of landscapes and homes that we inhabit. So, I've used this picture by Rubens describing paradise, which, if you like, sums up in a obviously rather fanciful way the way we used to live when we were hunters and gatherers. And the point about this is that people would kind of follow the food around, you know, so they would pluck fruit off a tree, not necessarily as faithfully as when Eve did it. And then when they've kind of denuded a local landscape, they would move on to another location and they would, if you like, follow the food around a territory. And so they would maybe come back to the same place in 6 months or a year when that landscape had had a chance to recover. So it was a peripatetic, a moving existence. But this all changed around about 12,000 years ago, which interestingly corresponds to the last major climate crisis the Earth underwent, namely the end of the last ice age, when sort of lush vegetation that had existed around the tropical regions of the world began to sort of recede northwards. And in regions like this, like the Mediterranean and also in the Indus Valley, you began to get a thinning of the vegetation and instead the evolution of grasses, grasslands like this one in the so-called Fertile Crescent, where basically the ancient antecedents of modern wheat and barley existed. And the people were starting to run out of food in essence because there was a population explosion, because it was getting warmer, and there was a crisis about what to eat. And people began to experiment with not an entirely new source of food. People had eaten grain before, but not systematically. They now began to save seeds and plant seeds, and to sort of, for grain, gradually became a much more major part of the diet. Now, they began to farm, in other words, and they probably began herding animals beforehand as well. So, I mean, different kinds of farming, the domestication of different kinds of foods, such as cows and sheep, but also various kinds of grain, began from around that period, about 12,000 years ago. And with that domestication, you see a completely different lifestyle developing, because instead of following the food around, people start to stay put because they're planting seeds in the ground and they need to be there when the seeds ripen, and they need to protect the seeds and the plants from animals that might come along and eat them. So you start to get more static settlements evolving up the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in Western Anatolia, modern day Turkey. And these gradually evolve in complexity. They get more complex until roughly 5,500 years ago, they create this little group down here, which are so sophisticated and complex that archaeologists generally agree that they, as it were, deserve the title of city. And this is in ancient Mesopotamia, and that comes, Mesopotamia just means between rivers. So the Tigris and Euphrates were the rivers that brought nourishment from the mountains of Anatolia down into the basin at the head of the Persian Gulf. So really the point of this slide is that agriculture, which was a new experimental way of eating, gave rise to static human settlements, which in turn gave rise to cities. So if you like, the headline of all of this, and it's all far more complex than I'm making out in my short talk, but nevertheless, farming and urbanity co-evolved. Now, if we look at what those early cities were like, we notice certain very interesting things. The first is that they are city-states. This means that you have an internal area, a very dense urban built-up area. So that little area of excavated housing would have been typical of the whole city. It's very small. It's only about 0.5 kilometer across. It's surrounded by farmland. It's on a river, which is bringing nourishment for the land, but also the means of watering it. So they built very large municipal earthworks, which were effectively the first municipal earthworks in history. So it's a very highly managed landscape. You could say this is the world's first countryside. And then very obviously in the middle of the city, you have this large temple complex. And in fact, the temple was not only the spiritual center of the city, but also the administrative center. So it was responsible for the most important event of the year, which is bringing in the harvest, offering the grain to the gods in the famous temple, the ziggurat of Ur, storing it in this large urban granary, then cooking the food, turning it into bread in the temple kitchens, which were huge, and then distributing the food around the city. So if we were going to ask the question of how did the world's first cities feed themselves, we would say that they were city-states with a local productive hinterland, and with a large centralized, in modern parlance, we would say food distribution hub, which was the temple. And non-coincidentally, things like writing to keep the farming accounts and money to do exchanges between one farmer and another over time were invented to cope with this much, much more complex way of living. Now, I mean, basically to sort of put the politics or the economics onto this, it's quite interesting if you look at both Plato and Aristotle, who were also living in a city-state, the polis of Athens. They become very interested in this question of how the city is going to feed itself. And indeed, most cities, indeed all cities in the ancient world, had some version of that original model, the city-state model. And now Aristotle, this is a picture of Aristotle here, he uses a very interesting term. He talks about humans being political animals. And I love this term because it talks about the inherent duality that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that humans need politics. In other words, they need cities to gather in and be political. And that's actually the Athenian agora, which is not only its main food market, but also its main political space, interestingly, because people came into the city, into the city centre, both to buy food and to meet one another and to talk. But they also needed nature. And so this dualism that really early sort of city-dwelling thinkers became very aware of, sort of led them to really puzzle out how, if you like, the socioeconomics of urbanity should work. And again, both Plato and Aristotle, more Aristotle than Plato actually, but for different reasons. Anyway, they talk about economia, this word down here, which means household management, from the Greek ekos, which just means house, and nomos, which means management. Now, what did that mean? Okay, I've gone forward by mistake, sorry. What it meant was that the ideal arrangement would be that every city would have a house in the city itself and a farm in the countryside, and the farm would feed the house. So ekos nomos, or household management, is basically you feed yourself. Every citizen, every household feeds itself. And if all citizens did that, and all citizens had a farm, then the state would be self-sufficient. And then the ideal size of the state would be the minimum size when there were enough people in it to do everything necessary, i.e., you had cobblers and you had stable boys and you had, slaves. Actually, I should mention there were 7 slaves in Athens to every citizen, but essentially enough people to sort of just keep the state going. And that both Plato and Aristotle reckoned was the ideal size for the city. And as I say, this model worked incredibly well. City-state was basically the model that every city in the world followed, until this one came along, Rome. So Rome is estimated to have had 1 million citizens by the 1st century AD. I mean, as you can see from this wonderful model in Eur, it essentially, it would have been impossible. It was a proper metropolis. It would have been impossible for a city this size to have fed itself just from its local hinterland. So basically, we have to ask ourselves a question of how did it feed itself? And normally in a live talk, I like to put this to the audience and ask people how they think Rome might have fed itself. So I might just ask you to wonder that for a little second or two. And I'll give you the answer. The answer is through food miles. Now, as I said at the beginning, we tend to think of food miles as a modern phenomenon, the fact that our food comes from hundreds or thousands of miles away, but actually it's not. So Rome really pioneered feeding itself in the way that we do today from a long, long way away. How was it able to do this? Well, critically, it was on the sea. Well, it was near enough to the sea, shall we say. It's actually 17 miles inland, irritatingly for it. But it had enough slaves to pull literally pull the food up the Tiber to the city, and also to man an enormous navy. which sequentially conquered Sardinia, Sicily, Carthage, and then very famously Egypt, all of which were very, very rich grain-producing regions, because remember, grain is the key food of cities. And then it was about 50 times cheaper to bring the food in by ship than it would have been to trundle it in on ox carts overland. In fact, it would have been physically utterly impossible for Rome to have fed itself from its local hinterland. A, because there wouldn't have been enough space, and B, because the transport would have been impossible. So it basically expanded the empire, both in terms of, just the idea of spreading its wonderful ideas, but also for the very practical reason of needing more and more space to feed 1 million hungry citizens. About a third of Roman citizens, about 300,000 people in Rome, were fed by the government on a free grain dole, and that it then extended to pork and wine and oil and all sorts of other things. And you can see from this map that indeed the city was importing wine, pork from Gaul, for example, fermented fish sauce from Spain, olive oil from all over the place, even fresh oysters from London at a certain point in its history. So you can see that the expansion of Rome had an impact over a vast region. Again, a region that was much, much bigger than the city itself. And you can also see it would have been very difficult for another large city the size of Carthage to have competed in this territory, which is one of the reasons why its defeat was so necessary. Egypt was critical. It became the grain basket of Rome. A huge depot was built at Alexandria. The grain ships from Alexandria were like the super tankers of their day, bringing in vast amounts of grain into the city. And it was extremely fertile. Although other regions became desiccated over the centuries because they were basically overexploited. And ultimately, I think it's reasonable to say that, the overexpansion of the empire meant that Rome effectively ended up eating itself to death, which indeed has been the fate of many civilizations over history. Now, we've seen how the feeding of a city can shape a landscape a long way away from the city itself. And the first person to really analyze how this would logically work was a German called Johann von Thünen, who in the early 19th century wrote a book called The Isolated State. And the isolated state was a flat, fertile, featureless plain. Oops, I just hit a lamp, which, was occupied only by logical, profit-seeking farmers. And he said that if a city was plonked in such a landscape, so that's represented by this pink blob, how would the productive hinterland naturally arrange itself? And he said, well, obviously you would have market gardening, so fruit and vegetables being grown close to the city. The reason being that these were very difficult foods to transport long distances because they tended to get squashed and to go off, so they had to be grown near the city. But they were also luxury foods, and therefore the farmers could afford the high land rents close to the city. And also they could make use of night soil. So night soil is a euphemism for human and animal manure, which was collected very assiduously and dumped on the land outside the city to make it more fertile. So creating a kind of ecological loop, effectively. You would then have a region of about 30 kilometers of mixed production, wood for fuel, but also grain. Now, the reason that it wasn't bigger than this is that grain, although it was the most important food of the city, was very heavy and bulky in relation to its value. So it wouldn't have been economic for the farmers to bring it in from further away than about 30 kilometers. So this actually limited the size to which the city could grow. And then on the outer ring, you have livestock grazing. Of course, the animals can walk into market, providing their own transport, so they could be grown from a lot further away. The only concession that von Thünen made to geography was to say that if the city was on a navigable river, then all of those bands could be a lot further away because you could bring the grain to the river and then take it in by water, which was much easier, probably 25 times cheaper, as it were, than coming over land. So that's all rather abstract and dull. And I remember being lectured on this in my first year at architecture school and kind of switching off very rapidly. It gets much more interesting if you look at real places. So here are two real places. We have London, my home city, on the left, and we have Paris on the right. And these are images taken roughly, you know, sort of at the same time, drawn at the same time. They're the main ports of both cities. So on the Thames, the legal quay, so-called, and in Paris, the Port au Blé, or the grain port. And again, in a live talk, I often like to ask people what essential difference they can see between these two images. So I'm going to give you a moment to puzzle on that. And then I'm going to tell you the critical difference. The critical difference is that the Thames is a navigable river. So it's full of ocean-going ships. The Seine is not, and therefore it's full of only river barges. And this had an absolutely profound effect. I often say, and I can say this with my Green Party colleagues in Flanders listening, I think this probably explains Brexit, if anything explains Brexit, which not much does. But it led to a completely different approach in these two cities to feeding themselves. So London, having access, as Rome had done, to the sea, it's merrily part of the Hanseatic League, which is this incredibly rich trading consortium in the North Sea and the Baltic, based originally on herring, which was owned by the Netherlands and Sweden, and then ultimately sort of traded in places like Antwerp, and in fact all over this region, but also able to trade in the Mediterranean and the Bay of Biscay and so on. So London from really early on is taking part in a sort of a medieval trading spree in Europe, if you like. And due to its position, it's doing very well out of it, as indeed was Antwerp at that time, and Ghent. So all of these cities were part of this trading jamboree. Paris, on the other hand, had almost the opposite condition. It was too far from the sea to be part of that. So instead of that, it imposed what are called provisioning rings on the countryside. So, I mean, something very important to remember is that harvests in the pre-industrial world, they failed about 1 in 3 times. There was a bad harvest. There was never quite enough food to go round. So the fact that the city was effectively marching into the countryside and saying, the city needs your grain, please give it over, was not, shall we say, a very popular policy at the time. In fact, it caused a huge amount of conflict. Now, in order to do this, the city appointed an enormous grain police. This was like a huge hierarchy of civil servants, basically, headed up by the king, who was called the baker of last resort. So basically, it's his job to feed people. And you can see from the Turgot plan, the wonderful Turgot plan of Paris, that here is the grain port that I was showing you earlier. The Hôtel de Ville is right there, as it would be, because you had to have political eyes on the trade going on. And then in an attempt to, I have no idea what I did then. Okay, I've undone it, whatever it was. In an attempt to consolidate all the food trades in Paris, all the markets were concentrated in one place, Les Halles, and that was close to the Louvre or the Royal Palace. So again, there was this attempt to concentrate all trade, which massively backfired, by the way, because essentially about a third of Paris's, or basically you can't control food in the way they were trying to control it, and about a third of the city's food was actually coming in on the black market. And of course, more importantly, when the harvest failed, which they often did, the city was unable to bring in emergency grain from elsewhere because it couldn't just import it as Rome had done and as London did. So in fact, the Far, who were the porters in Les Halles, they went around spreading rumors that it was the king's fault that people were starving. It was all down to him. And of course, famously in 1789, this led to revolution. Now, just before that happened, something very, very interesting. Adam Smith, who was busy working on a book called The Origins of the Wealth of Nations, paid a visit to Paris, and he met the leading economists of his day, the so-called physiocrats. And the physiocrats were desperately trying to work out how to feed the city, led by François Quesnay. I'm probably pronouncing that terribly badly anyway. And François Quesnay, he said that basically the most important people in the world were farmers, and all wealth came from the land. And therefore, basically, he was arguing for a kind of protectionist economy where France would really cut itself off and it would just produce food. But inside France, he would free up trade. So he was arguing for free trade inside France. And Adam Smith said that that was a brilliant idea. He agreed that all wealth came from the land, and he thought free trade was a wonderful idea. But instead of limiting it to France, he thought it should be global. And he recognized that the great commerce, unlike Quesnay, who basically said only farmers produce wealth, Adam Smith argued that trade produces wealth. So he said the great commerce of every civilized society is that carried on between the inhabitants of this town and those of the country. And he went on further to say that a city on a navigable river like London could grow to great wealth, even at the expense of its local inhabitants, interestingly. Anyway, we all know kind of how the story ends. There were a series of failed harvests. There were riots, food riots. The king, Louis XVI, tried to flee. And basically, he was portrayed as being too greedy to save his own skin. So he is portrayed as having stopped to have an enormous meal, even as he was trying to flee the city, which is why the police caught up with him. And this political cartoon of the time is called Les gros oiseaux ont le vent long, or fat birds fly slowly. Basically, he got blamed, and he was, we all know how it ends up. He lost his head. And really, if you want a kind of summary of why politicians hate being responsible for feeding people, this pretty much sums it up. Now, in contrast, London, none of this ever happened. So it's freely importing food, surrounded by market gardens, as indeed was Paris. So this is back to the von Thunen model, but loads of grain is coming in by river to the main ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate. It's trying to make its way up to Cornhill, where it was traded. It's traveling up. You can tell, I mean, this is something very interesting. If you look at, and indeed Chris was reminding me earlier, that, you know, when you basically look at any city that was founded before the railways, you can often see street names with food on them, and you can actually physically see how the food was traveling through the city. So Bread Street, for example, shows you that bread was being traded here, making its way up from the port to the main market. Friday Street here was where you went to buy your fish on a Friday. Sorry, the blue is fish, sorry. Also obviously coming in by river, again to the two main ports. Billingsgate, interestingly, remained London's main fish market until the late 1980s. So it's amazing how long markets once established often continue in one place. Fish Street is obviously where you could also buy fish. Friday Street, as I was saying, is where you could buy fish on a Friday when the eating of meat was forbidden, as it was in many European countries for centuries. And then lastly, meat is actually walking into the city physically, as I say. Most of London's meat was coming in from places like Yorkshire and Scotland and Wales, where there's lots of very good grass. It's walking in to a smooth field outside the city, Smithfield, which remains London's meat market today, although it's just about to shut. So it's been there for 1100 years. Poultry is where the turkeys and geese were sold, and they were coming in mostly from Norfolk and coming in this way, as indeed they still do. So not only was the feeding of cities shaping landscapes, it was also shaping cities themselves. And indeed, if you lived in a city in the pre-industrial world, you couldn't have been under any doubt as to where your food came from, because it was basically mooing and bleating in front of you. This is Smithfield, when it was still a livestock market in the 1830s. And there were 184 unregulated slaughterhouses around this space. So you can imagine the chaos, and frankly, not a very, very pleasant scene at all. All the unwanted offal went into the Fleet River, which basically completely clogged up. But as I say here, it was necessary chaos, because basically the city had to have food coming in. And I would say London in the mid-19th century was arriving at a crisis point, if you like, in the sense that this was becoming pretty untenable. There were about 2.5 million Londoners at this point, and it was getting very, very difficult to feed the city. So in a sense, from London's point of view, it's very, very lucky that shortly after this, indeed a year after this, there was a new invention, which was the railways. And this changes everything radically. Three key things change. Because the railways make it possible to transport food over long distances rapidly. Of course, the animals no longer have to walk into market. I mean, actually, you can see cows hitching a ride on the train here. But mostly what happened is that livestock could now be slaughtered out of the city and brought in as dead meat. So the first thing that changes is that food, having been very visible, because it's literally in the center of the city as a live animal, now becomes invisible, and it starts to travel down different roads. Secondly, cities, which until this point, have been constrained by geography, by the difficulty of feeding themselves, they can now grow any size and shape they like. And last but not least, politicians who had reluctantly been, at least to a certain degree, in control of the food system, now, if you like, completely wiped their brows with relief, because the new nascent food industries were going to do the work for them. So you can see this very clearly. Here's London in 1840. It's barely bigger than the medieval city. Very quickly, once the railways came, it sprawls into this absolutely massive metropolis that you couldn't possibly have fed from just a few little markets that you walked to. And of course, the rural landscape is transformed radically as well. So this is the American Midwest before the railways, with an estimated 60 million bison wandering around, and of course, Native Americans living as kind of hunter-gatherers with them. They are slaughtered in the space of a decade, often with from machine guns, from trains, mass slaughter. That's a pile of buffalo skulls. They didn't really do much with the meat. They did a little bit with the skins, but the point was to clear the land. And of course, the Native Americans were sent off to reservations. And this was the result. Basically, the world's first vast monocultural grain production, which also led to the world's first grain glut. And again, my little quiz, for those of you who are still paying attention, is the question of what do you do if you've got so much grain that you can't eat it anymore? And the answer to that one is, of course, that you feed it to animals. So actually, so-called meat packing, which is the practice of feeding grain to animals, had existed before the railways, but the coming of the railways saw a massive expansion of it. So this is really the beginning of industrialized meat on a major scale. This is the Chicago Union Stockyards in 1880, and you can see, well, you can't count, but I mean, there were up to 17 million animals going through it at this point, raised on the prairies and then brought into these pens to be fattened up on cheap grain before being slaughtered in these slaughterhouses. And then crucially exported to the East Coast cities and beyond to Europe. Now, how did they do this? Because that's actually a journey of about 1,000 miles from Chicago to some of the East Coast cities. And the answer is what we would now call the chill chain. So the meat packers and indeed Swift himself built a special railway and ice depots all the way along. So in the winter, they would cut lake ice and they would store it in depots. And then they had these railway carriages where they would hang blocks of ice at either end, and they could hang the dressed carcasses of the animals, slaughtered animals, in the middle. And because the railway was fast enough, it would then keep the meat fresh. And they could then set up these kind of little booths. This is one in New York, which basically flogging this this unusual source of meat. People didn't tend to trust meat that was not from their local butcher, but it was sold very cheaply. And so they were able to undercut local butchers who went out of business. So it's really the beginning of what we would now in modern term call the consolidation of the food industry and the ownership of the vertical ownership of the supply chain, which means that you're not only producing the meat, but you're transporting it and flogging it. Now, the problems with this way of feeding ourselves became apparent very rapidly. So this is what happened when all of that grassland that had been kept stable by the bison was turned into monocultural grain production. So an annual crop and the land was ploughed. the root stems, instead of being kind of, 12 foot deep, went to being sort of 6 inches deep. The soil became dry, it lost its moisture content. And then in a series of very dry summers over the course of the 30s, literally all the topsoil in the Midwest just blew away. It's an absolutely massive ecological disaster. And that really is the beginning of the debate over how we should feed ourselves and produce food. So on the one hand, we have Justus Liebig, who was the brilliant German chemist who first worked out that what plants mostly need as nourishment is NPK, which is nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And if you chucked enough chemicals on the ground, you could make the same patch of land produce food over and over again. And in order to do that, he had to, well, not he, but actually some other also brilliant German chemists called Haber-Bosch, who, Karl Haber and Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, who had been actually working on chemical weapons during the First World War. They redirected their efforts towards a process here called the Haber-Bosch process, which is to atmospherically fix nitrogen, which means take nitrogen in the air and turn it into ammonia, which then means you can use it to nourish crops. Now, I mean, that's, interestingly, somewhere between 2 out of 5 of people on the planet are now fed with food grown using this process. So this has been a massive, in fact, it's allowed a massive population explosion in the 20th century. But there are issues. So Albert Howard, if you like, was the father of the organic movement. And he was basically saying this is crazy. Basically, it goes against nature. It's not the way we build nourishment in soil. What really goes on in soil is you need living soil. And it's all about the so-called mycorrhizal connections between the plants and soil fungi, which is like a little nourishment exchange in the ground where, where the plants can do this amazing trick, which no other creature can do, which is basically they can turn sunlight into sugar. This is the process known as photosynthesis. And it's the basis of the entire global food chain. They feed the sugars to the fungi, soil fungi, which are busy literally extracting minerals out of rock in the soil. And the soil fungi feed the micronutrients to the plants. And it's the basis of plant health and the rich, nourishing complexity of a sort of organically grown plant, which then becomes the basis of human health. Now, very interestingly, in the kind of 30s and 40s, Howard was actually winning this argument. But unfortunately, this happened. And during the war, as you can see from this rather brilliantly designed poster, there was a massive push to grow more food. Didn't matter, nobody really cared how, just increase production. And indeed, that was done by basically going towards monocultures, mechanization, and after the war, critically using more fertilizer and pesticides, both of which came out of munitions factories in the war. And part of the thinking was, let's keep the chemical factories going because we might have to switch them back to war production if there's another war. So it was a pivotal moment. And of course, after the war, I am leaping through enormous issues very rapidly. I am aware of that, but I'm just trying to build up a big picture of kind of how we got where we are. Cars kind of took over from trains. You began to get sort of these extraordinary, can you even call this urban, these kind of landscapes where the houses are all spaced apart. Of course, this is all on prime farmland because they were surrounding towns which were all deliberately built on prime farmland because that's what you always did in the ancient world. The replacement of city centres with malls, and basically air conditioning, meaning people were happy to walk around inside a large box, and the denaturing of food. So basically food becomes something that sells itself to you in a packet. And she just popped out for a pint of milk and she came back with all that stuff and she's going to stick it in the fridge and it's going to go off. So it's the beginning of our sort of denatured relationship with food. Cities become eviscerated. This is a very interesting map that was done of New York. Basically, that's Central Park. So this is Manhattan, that's the posh bit. This is the Bronx and Harlem. The red bits refer to food deserts, which is where you have to walk more than 200 meters for any source of fresh food. And of course, those map onto all the poor bits, all the poor neighborhoods, which are also areas of high obesity and deprivation and crime and all the rest of it. So the city fathers, if you like, are no longer feeding people like they did in Ur. The market is basically feeding people, and it just goes where the money is. And this is what the food market looks like today. It's highly consolidated. Many of these companies have annual profits bigger than national GDPs. They're incredibly powerful. Most politicians can't go up against them because they just don't have the power. And we've invented this thing called cheap food that doesn't work. I mean, I often like to remind people at this point of what food actually is. It consists of living things that we nurture and then kill so that we can live. So food is life. And it's really weird that we expect it to be cheap, because to cheapen food is to cheapen life. But this is how we've done it. We've externalized all the true costs of our food. So we've got about a third of soils globally lost or degraded, about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions now associated with agriculture, a lot of it to do with deforestation, to create grazing or fodder for cattle. About 70% of global freshwater is involved in farming. A lot of that is from non-renewable sources. We've got about 2 billion people globally overweight, but also 1 billion undernourished. So we've invented this historical first, which is to have fat people who don't have enough nourishment. About 50% of lakes globally and river deltas are affected by what's called eutrophication, which is basically excess runoff of chemicals, chemical fertilizers that cause these algae blooms that then starve fish of oxygen. We're wasting up to 50% of the food we produce. This is from a supermarket dumpster, all perfectly good food. We feed about a third of the global grain harvest to animals, and it takes about 10 times as much grain to feed us if it's gone through an animal first. So that's bonkers. We're spending about 10 calories of energy on every calorie we consume. So that's bonkers as well. And last but not least is a rapid decline, as you've probably heard, of insects and farmland birds. And really, we're staring down the barrel of a sixth mass extinction. So these are just some of the externalities of this cheap food that we rely on. And we can't go on like this. But unfortunately, this is where the world is heading, because all the embedded power in food is in status quo. So we have a real problem. Now, interestingly, I mean, I think COVID throws some very interesting light in all of this. The first big takeaway from COVID, I mean, apart from the fact that, you know, it is a zoonotic disease, and zoonotic diseases are the result of lack of biodiversity, which is precisely what we've created with our food system. But also just this very, very strong sense that we're all in this together, and that we now live in a global world and there are no boundaries. And many, many interesting things have come out of it and are coming out of it. So, for example, we saw in India at the beginning of lockdown, 47 million people who were working in cities didn't really live in cities. They were actually living precarious existence, and their real home was in their villages. So there was this mass migration. Many people actually died on the way home. We're also seeing, as I say, the dangers of this encroachment on the natural world, on wilderness, that's becoming a really major threat. We're seeing enormous inequalities in our societies. So I thought this was a very interesting image from Bangkok, where basically there's a group of people who can afford to sit at home and just order in their food. And then we have these socially distanced delivery people waiting to pick up their takeaways for them. So, you know, sort of really big divisions in society being exposed. You know, the fact that we don't value our food means that, you know, most European nations import farm labor, often almost paid slave wages to feed them. And we discovered in the UK that we were 93,000 Romanians short of a fruit and vegetable harvest. And that's being played out in various ways all across the industrialized world. So different aspects of fragility that COVID has shown us, but also interestingly, different aspects of potential resilience. So we saw in the UK a huge, and all over Europe as well, of course, a huge upsurge in neighborliness, people baking for one another, looking out for each other. This enforced lockdown, people suddenly discovered, oh, actually it's quite nice to cook with my kids. And so this rediscovery of what it is to spend time over food, to take pleasure around meals, the fact that we have to eat, a spontaneous springing up of new networks, all the suppliers that used to supply restaurants, desperately were searching for new consumers, and new local food networks has sprung up all over the place that have been very successful. So connecting producers to consumers for the first time. And of course, a big increase in interest in growing your own. So where does this all lead us? Well, I mean, I think on one level where it leads us is a realization that we need to just rethink where we're heading. Basically, that's what COVID potentially can give us, is a massive chance to press the reset button. And I love this quote from the English architect Cedric Price. Sorry, he basically said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And as I said at the beginning, I mean, I think, we've got where we are through amazing discoveries to do with technology, but we've forgotten the big question that lies behind it, which is, what is a good life? And what we discover if we re-ask this question is that the big questions are the same as they've been for millennia, which is basically, how do you lead a good life? What makes us happy? And most importantly, how do we keep this thing going? So Plato and Aristotle, as I said earlier, they talked about limiting the size of the city so that it could be self-sufficient. Thomas More's Utopia repeats that idea. He proposed a series of self-sufficient city-states networked together in which everybody, man, women and children, all farmed. And Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, a model that I still think is extremely interesting today, is really Thomas More with railways. It's basically progressive land reform leading to a series of city-states networked together by railway. The idea being that you can solve the urban paradox. You can have the best of both worlds. You can have enough density of human existence, but also you don't have to be thousands of miles away from the land that feeds you. Now, these are all utopian ideas. And the problem with utopia, as you can see from this little graphic here, is that it means a good place, but also no place. So it's a kind of ideal vision, but it can't exist. And I remember being very upset by this when I discovered this about 15 years ago. And I thought, well, we live in a world shaped by food, so maybe we need a new word, Sitopia, and that just means food place, because really food shapes our lives in every way and it connects all the important parts of our lives together. But we live in a bad Sitopia because we don't value food. So here is an amazing opportunity, I think. If we did value food, we could change the world. So how would we do that? Well, the first thing to know is that basically the stuff that you eat every day that you're familiar with, it shapes everything. So these wonderful images from this fantastic book, Hungry Planet, basically went around the world looking at, a week's worth of food among different families, and then asking a series of questions: what kind of landscapes are produced, how healthy are people, and so on. And they're really, really interesting. So, for example, in Britain, I think the average person eats 2 of their 5 a day or their 7 a day. I mean, we don't eat fruit and vegetables. And look at it. I mean, there's one broccoli among a whole series of packets of crisps and biscuits and so on, because we have a special relationship with America, who basically pioneered industrial food. On the other hand, in Egypt, that's pretty much all they eat. It's all unpackaged, it's all local. But of course, they've got big family structures, and probably the women in the family do nothing but shop and cook all day and raise children. So you go back to that early hunter-gatherer, you hunt, I cook. And in Italy, of course, it's kind of halfway. They have a lovely cuisine, but they also have the sinister march of the soda pops sort of coming to get them. So from these pictures, you can extrapolate landscapes, sociability, the shapes of cities, the way we lead our lives. Are we raising cows on grass, which they evolved to do, and we can't eat grass, so that is why we co-evolved with cows, by the way? Or are we feeding them on food that we could be eating in a concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO? That's 160,000 cows wandering around in their own poo, getting sick and being pumped through with antibiotics to make them not get sick, which then means we can't use the antibiotics. Do we go into the center of a city to meet people to buy our food, or do we leave in the name of convenience? Do we take time to share food? Again, something people are rediscovering over COVID. or are we too busy to eat? And before lockdown, it was fascinating. My favorite stat actually was that 20% of people were eating in America, were eating their meals in cars. 20% of meals in America were being eaten in a car. So then the question is, okay, which of these is actually giving us a good life? And it's that way up. It's not the question of how are we going to feed the world. It's the question of what is a good life, and then what we're feeding ourselves gets us that good life. It goes back to true value. It's very ironic that it's usually in a crisis that we understand the true value of food. So London during the Second World War, Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, Detroit after the cars left, they all saw a massive resurgence in organic, locally grown food because people suddenly, well, they were running out of food, there was no choice, but also then those became a sort of the basis of new communities and new societies. And of course, we're seeing that now with COVID. We have to work with nature. The jury is no longer out. We know this. Never believe the people, in big ag who say only big ag can feed the world. This has been disproven. I've shown you all the pictures. I've given you the stats. Basically, the world is being destroyed and we are destroying ourselves with the way we eat. Luckily, there are literally hundreds of amazing models of how we can farm with nature. There are ideas that, the two Australians in the 1970s, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, called permaculture. It just means imitating nature and working with nature, as Albert Howard advocated, so that we basically can kind of get a balanced system going. That's a forest garden, which mimics a forest. This is just the idea of working with the living soil. Chefs like Dan Barber in the States saying, it's not a question of saying, I want steak and chips, how can I produce it? But saying, what does the landscape want to feed me, and eating that. We need rural reform. And again, these are all enormous ideas, but regenerative farming. And again, there's thousands of models. No-till, for example, which preserves those mycorrhizal connections in the soil. Land, this is a wealth tax, a progressive land value tax, which Albert Howard adopted in his Garden City model. The idea that wherever you are and wherever you live, you have the right to food sovereignty, and there are many global movements fighting for this, and anarchist ideas, which are very interesting, about how we can reimagine the landscape so that it's not just city over here and country over here, but actually more complex combinations of both. We need, I believe, what I call a Satopian economy. I'm actually proposing reinvesting the true value of food in food, which, yes, would make food more expensive, but actually at the moment, organic food is the only food that actually pays its true cost. And I think if we did that with all food, then actually things like industrial meat production would become completely unaffordable, which they already are, and we would see that. So it's ideas like investing in regenerative farming, incorporating food in transition towards a zero carbon economy, revisiting what economia can mean in modern terms, lots of new economic thinking like Kate Raworth's donut economics, where we basically balance our needs with those of nature and with other people. We need to democratize the food system. At the moment, it's a monopoly that looks like this. And we can do it very simply by just joining the roots to the branches. And this is already happening. This is what the food movement does. This is Carlo Petrini, the founder of the slow food movement, and his idea of co-producing, as he calls it. And this means meeting the people who feed us halfway. And again, this has been happening under lockdown. Community-supported agriculture, for example, which is where city dwellers pay farmers to farm for them ahead, and that you might even go and work on the farm. It's a great day out for the kids. Food co-ops like this one in Brooklyn that's been going for 50 years, where you basically work a certain number of hours and they do long-term relationships with local farmers. We all know what organic box schemes are. And this is a kind of a whole town in the UK that went guerrilla gardening mad. It's about incorporating food in our planning. So yes, growing food in cities, but a city can't feed itself. And this is very important to understand, because that is the urban paradox. We will always need this relationship between the city and the countryside, but that doesn't mean we can't bring back the things that cities can grow, which is fruit and vegetables, and by the way, pigs and chickens, which used to historically inhabit the city because pigs and chickens can eat food waste. And again, this is happening in parts of Asia. incorporating food in governance, like the Toronto Food Policy Council did 25 years ago. We all know what farmers markets are. It's about making space in the city that farmers can come directly, but also food hubs, because farmers actually quite like farming. They don't necessarily want to come into the city and flog you their food directly. So we need places still where they can send their food and it can be curated and people can come. Infrastructure is really important. This is a local abattoir in the New York State. It's one of only 3 remaining, and farmers have, you know, basically who farm their animals with love want the animals to have a good death. So we need local abattoirs if we're going to have this. And the idea of patchwork farming. So it's like you farm where you can, and then also you do, you know, it's a systemic system, a systemic thinking process where the city will, of course, always also import food from outside. I'm nearly at the end, by the way, in case you're losing the will to live. It's also about what I call maximizing the urban-rural interface. So this is what all the old utopians were trying to do. They were trying to sort of keep the city small so that there was still access to countryside. But there's many ways of doing this. You can actually preserve strips of countryside, as Patrick Geddes proposed, so the city evolves in a star shape. You can post-fit the city with productive landscapes like London-based architect Bernard Viljoen are proposing continuous productive urban landscapes. You can interrogate the productive hinterland of the city and say, what can it grow? And there's huge inherent latent productivity in many hinterlands. This is an example of New York's food shed. And then reconnect the city to its countryside. Or we can build new bits of city like the Dutch architects MVR in Almere Oosterwald, where basically you can have a house, but you've got to have a farm too. A sort of interestingly urban development going on there. Governance is really important. I mean, I'm thrilled to be talking to a political party who actually gets food. I think the Greens are really the only party who have always understood the importance of food. I'm arguing for a kind of more nested governance, which comes from the way we manage commons, and maybe we can discuss this in our chat later. But I'm also saying that, you know, food and taking care of food is the one thing that actually addresses all of the UN development goals. So putting it at the heart of our thinking makes incredible sense. It's about creating good work. We're all facing an imminent jobs crisis, as we know. This is what British cheese used to look like in 1970 when nobody wanted to pay anything for cheese. We now have 650 artisanal cheese shops in Britain. So if we value food, because we've all got to eat every day, then we can create wonderful jobs for people as well. So valuing food actually does lead to a good life and good work and meaning and love in everything we do. I'm going to come back to my first slide. Not my first slide, about my fourth slide, actually, the one with the Hadza eating around the fire. I believe that the best metaphor for a good society is one in which everyone eats well, because if you eat well, and that means you're secure, you have a home, you know, and you're eating good food, which was produced without damaging a landscape or people or animals in any way, then everything else follows from it. And we're very, very good at sharing through food because that's how we evolved. So I think we need to reinvest value in food, make this the focus of our thinking, and everything else will flow from it. It's about seeing the world through food. I guess I'm trying to offer you food as a lens through which to see the world and to see that basically everything's connected and we do have the power to change the world. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to know more, this is my new book called Utopia, and you can find out much more there. But thanks very much for having me too. And I will stop sharing and start talking.
Okay. Carolyn, many thanks for this inspiring talk. You took us through, let's say, the history of humankind, at least the last 10,000 years. And especially also, of course, the history, food and cities is very close to us because I think in Belgium, our green councillors are doing great jobs in the different cities where they are in government. I now first want to give the floor to Chris Steenwegen. He's, as introduced earlier, a member of the Flemish Regional Parliament, and he's following policies concerning environment protection. And before, I said he was working at Nature Conservation NGO. So Chris, I give you directly the floor.
Thank you, Dirk, and thank you, Carolyn, for your inspiring presentation. Only yesterday I was asked to give a reply on your talk, so I was not able to read your book completely. And it's a thick book, and it's not easy to get through it. There's many, many things in there. But I try to grab some of the ideas that are in it, and I will come to them later because there is also some questions. But I apologize for the many, many things that are in the book, and I will not go into.
I'm very impressed you got your head around it in a day. It took me 8 years to write.
Of course, we recognize a lot of things you say about how our food system is organized today. We see this industrial agriculture and food industry dominated by a few international concerns who have 8% of the market. Huge speculation also on trade markets with food like grain, and very high external costs that are not reflected in the price of our food. And of course, health issues like obesity on one side and hunger on the other side. And farmers that are not able to get a decent income, although they work very, very hard. We also experience this distancing, the fact that we are not that close anymore to our food. And as they say today, when you ask children where does the milk come from, they say from the supermarket, and not from the cow. So now I will go quickly through my notes, but we also have been struck very hard by COVID, and also agriculture in Belgium and in Flanders. And I recognize some of the things you presented as we couldn't find enough people to work for seasonal work. Some of our products were not allowed to be exported to some areas, so we had a lot of products that was not usable. Those shortages, though, of food in our supermarkets, like you showed in Britain, we did have shortages in toilet paper, but that was more due to hamstering the toilet paper, I think. I don't know why people hamster toilet paper, but that's reality. But we also seen some positive effects on this COVID crisis. And one of the things we've seen is the interest for food, for local farmers and their products, and also for the joy of preparing food at home.
Yes.
Because people had to stay home, they couldn't go out to eat in restaurants. For instance, numerous people started baking their own bread at home.
Yes.
And the amount of people that were buying their products, their groceries, it was on a local farm, and it tripled in a few months' time.
Yeah.
So people, I think, prefer to go there because they were a little bit afraid of mixing with all other people in a supermarket, but also they have more trust in the quality and in the local farmers. We've seen some positive effects, and we see that COVID so strengthened the movement that is going on, and that you also describe in your book, a movement that aims at bringing consumer and producer back in contact with each other on a particular base, and more also in concepts of solidarity and cooperation.
Yeah.
And you gave some examples also about that, like community sustained agriculture. And of course, we see also in our cities the development of local food strategies in order to restore the bond between the city and the rural area around it. And I can say in the cities where the Greens are in the government, it's one of the main topics. It's one of the priorities to establish such food strategies. Now, before I formulate just a few questions, I want to give you some insight of how farming and food industry works in Belgium. when I started to be interested and working on agriculture and ecology, we had more than 60,000 farms in Belgium. Today we have hardly 20,000, a little bit more than 20,000. So more than 1,000 farms a year, farmers stop a year. So we have this trend that I think we see everywhere. Because of the proximity of the port of Antwerp, we have a big livestock. There are more pigs in Flanders than people. And we see also that the scale of the farms are still growing rapidly. We talk about mega stables today. The space in Flanders is very there's not much space in Flanders because of urbanization and many people and industry and so on. So the land is very expensive, which is an important element. And there are many users that claim part of that land that is still available. The prices, I suppose it will be also familiar with you, but for instance, the price of grain has not changed in 30 years. And for other products, it's the same. And we also have a very open economy, so export is very important for us. We are a big exporter. Netto, we are an exporter of about 9 billion euros a year, but we also a big importer. So we have a very open economy on food. Now, my questions have to do with this. First, of course, the pricing. It's a very important element in agriculture and food industry. What do we pay as consumers for our foods on one hand, and what gets a farmer for his products on the other hand? And it's both very difficult issues, I think. And you talked about it earlier about it, and it's written also in your book. From the consumer side, you talk about these two approaches to agriculture, on the industrial approach and the organic approach, where the choice is, I think, clear for you and also for us. We have to evolve to an agriculture that works with nature instead of against nature, but this will come with a higher price for the consumer, since we will have to pay directly in our price the external cost that we don't see today. But then about how you see this solution, I have some questions about that, because you say, well, we can. There will be more jobs in agriculture, good jobs, interesting jobs where people want to work in agriculture and in this food industry, and they will have an income there, and then they will be able to pay more for their food. But this might be a solution for some, but I think for others not. So I have some questions about this. How do you see this? Maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Then from the perspective of the producer, a farmer is a price taker and not a price setter. So he's totally dependent on the price he gets on the market, which is today a world market for many products. And as you mentioned also in your book, there's a very great volatility in food prices because it's impossible to predict how much of a product will come on the market. Can you say something about that? What possibilities do you see to get a better income for farmers and people working in this industry? Because we see a lot of bad labor conditions for people working, like, for instance, in a slaughterhouse, that kind of things. Today, we don't see a direct correlation between the price in the supermarket and the price you pay is paid on the farmer. And I gave the example of the grain. The grain price has stayed the same, but the bread price has grown a lot. So that's one thing about the pricing. The other thing is access to land. And I think it's also very important if we want to develop a strategy in the way that you want it and that we want it. In our region, it's a very big problem because of the price is so high. And in your book, it's very interesting. You go back to anarchists and the fact that, well, more or less the idea that land should not be in private ownership, but should be in collective hands, which is, of course, an idea that today also have a lot of supporters with it's all the idea of the commons. It's very popular today also with us. But can you elaborate a little bit more on that? How we can give access to land in a society that today in Belgium, in Flanders, is extremely focused on private ownership.
Okay, maybe.
So, yes, these are my two questions.
Sorry to intervene, but maybe let's first give Carolyn the possibility to ask these two very simple questions, of course.
Yeah, exactly. I was kind of thinking I need to read my book again. Paying more for food. I mean, yeah, I think the reason I wrote the book that I did, and weirdly, I now want to show you a drawing because I'm an architect. So this is how I think. The book came from a drawing. And the drawing was trying, this will be relevant, by the way. I was trying to work out in 2011, in fact, where food sits in our world. And I drew a plate of food and then a table around the plate, people around the table, a sharing connection, a cook figure, nurturing, gratitude. So that became the space of the home, a market, you know, so exchange, trust, economy. The market sits in the city sits in the countryside sits in nature, and nature sits in the universe. So the book is a section through that drawing. So what does that make sense? Do you have to be an architect for that to make sense?
No.
It goes, you know, food, body, home, society, city and country, nature and time. But so it's a series of overlapping scales. Now, the reason I show you that is that when you're asking a question like, how do we get people to pay more for food? You can't just look at one bit of the question. You have to look at every bit of the question. So, you know, absolutely, if I'm a sort of working in an Amazon fulfillment center, not feeling very fulfilled, and, you know, I'm struggling to pay my rent, then I'm not going to be able, even if I wanted to do anything other than buy the cheapest food I can find. So you can't make people pay more for food unless you say we can't have people working on such low wages that they can't afford to eat better food. So automatically, immediately, you're arguing for a more equitable society. And you might be arguing for universal basic income, or you might be arguing for a more rigorously enforced and more generous minimum wage, but you're definitely arguing for a different economics. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I'm a great believer in pleasure and desire as being motivators for action. So, you know, basically what really interests me about lockdown, I mean, nobody, if you'd have said to the British people, you know, 6 months ago, hey, we're going to lock you up all in your houses kind of for 6 months. You're going to have to school your kids, you're going to have to cook with them and so on. There would have been riots. I mean, even Boris Johnson, who I think is a total and utter idiot, I'm just going to put that on the record. But anyway, and that's the least I could say about him. But sorry, stop it, Karen, and get on with answering the question. Basically, even he didn't think the British people would put up with being locked in their houses. He couldn't have been more wrong. We're the most lockdown loving nation in Europe by a long way. We like it. And this is really, really interesting to me. And I think part of it is that, you know, we had this kind of what I call the hamster wheel kind of approach to a good life, which is basically, you know, you just spend your whole life doing this. You're dashing to work, you're commuting to work, you're doing work, you're getting back, you're too busy to cook, too busy to see the kids, too exhausted to do anything. You know, you open a bottle of wine, you collapse into bed, and then you get up the next day and do it again. I mean, this is not a good life. But we bought the rhetoric of this being a good life. Now, what lockdown's done in a sort of as a social experiment that we never, ever could have imposed politically is people have gone, hey, I quite like not spending 4 hours in a sardine can going into the middle of the city. I quite like seeing more of my kids. I quite like being at home and having time to do the gardening. So these are all these are all political gold in my view, because you can actually say to people, look, okay, you quite like all of this lockdown stuff. I mean, of course, we're not going to stop you going back to work. Of course, we have to work out what to do with city centres. But how about we start to design the world so that you can spend more time in your home and in your garden and in your locality. I mean, I think the locality thing is really interesting as well, as you said. You know, this discovery of, oh, I can actually buy my food from local farmers. And this is quite nice. You know, this is absolutely beautiful. I mean, there's the potential for saying to people, you know, it's not that you're going to have to, I mean, people are paying more for food, actually, but they're paying more for the actual food. What they're paying less for is going into the middle of the city and paying for some restaurant with fancy this, that, and the other, you know. So actually, as people like me have known for years, if you don't eat much out in restaurants and you just buy your food directly from producers, you can buy literally the best food there is and cook it yourself. So go for the kind of the pleasure aspect, go for the kind of, you know, these are for me the beginnings of a new vision of a good life that have just been granted to us. And this is the amazing political opportunity that we have. So it's not saying to people, pay more for your food. It's saying, hey, you could buy food from your local farmer and you could bake your own bread and you can buy high quality flour. And now you have the time to taste it, you can tell the difference. And, you know, it's going to the value thing. But yes, people have to have the opportunity. They have to have houses that they want to live in. They have to have access to land. So this is where my concept of, I mean, to come on to your other question, well, okay, so another part of the drawing, if you like. So, you know, if these people are starting to get really excited by this and they're going for local markets, then the farmers who I haven't drawn on that drawing, but I slightly have drawn on a slightly charted up version of it, you know, they start to get paid more. You know, the whole thing starts to be a sort of a virtuous circle rather than a kind of a negative circle. And I think that's the insight, is that paying more for food, it changes everything. And some of the things are difficult to bring into being. So as you rightly say, access to land, a really, really big one. I mean, by the way, I know a lot of farmers who have done brilliantly under lockdown because they've been getting all of the money for their food rather than the sort of the tiny percentage that they got when they went through the food system. So that's really interesting. Access to land. I mean, yes, when I was researching the Garden City, I found it really, really interesting. Ebenezer Howard's two key influences were Henry George, who was, I don't know, I mean, actually, so Henry George was, as you know, I'm sure, a 19th century American economist who watched the railways being built in the US and actually thought, hey, this is weird. You know, people who just happen to own a bit of scrubby land next to where they happen to build a railway station are suddenly getting really rich and they're doing nothing. They're just benefiting from the fact that someone's built a railway. So he proposed this idea, as you rightly said, it comes originally from the anarchists, that all land is collectively owned. But if you want a special bit of it, if you want exclusive use of it, you just pay a rent to the community for this, you know. So this is basically the idea that Henry George basically sort of puts into an economic framework, and he calls it land value tax. So basically, if I'm sitting on a bit of inner city land, that's quite valuable. So I pay the community quite a bit for that, but that's fine because I can earn it back in my high rents that I'm extracting. But if I earn a bit of agricultural land in the middle of nowhere, that's worth almost nothing unless I can build a house on it, but I can't build a house on it, and therefore I can afford to farm it. So it's a really, really interesting idea, I think. But I think, you know, one way or another, and the really difficult bit is to work out how you do it incrementally over time. Because obviously if you know, a party sort of says, we're going to come and seize your property, you're not going to get voted in. So I think it has to be done over time. And I think it has to be done, for example, through things like inheritance tax and so on. But I also think, you know, alongside that, you know, we need incredibly strong planning. I mean, one of the things that struck me sorry, you did ask lots of questions, so I'm taking a rather long time to answer them all, but I'll stop talking in a minute. But, you know, one of the things that struck me very strongly when I was writing Zootopia is that planning is a socialist activity, because those on the right wing just think that the market should decide what happens everywhere. And we know what happens if the market decides. So, you know, planning is basically saying who does and does not have access to what. And I think, you know, alongside land value tax, we need a vision of what kind of place we're trying to create. And that's what I call a landscape for human flourishing. And a landscape for human flourishing is a landscape where, if you like, the people who've done well under lockdown could tell you what it is having a nice house, is having a garden probably, you know, or access to open space if you don't have a garden, is having access to local services, it's having security and, you know, the possibility of being creative, actually. And these are all anarchist ideas. And that's why I'm very interested in Peter Kropotkin, who's the other major influence on the Garden City, because he talks about that book I showed, Field, Factories and Workshops, is basically about bringing opportunity everywhere. It's not about just having a carpet where there's no distinction between countryside and city, but it's just saying that, you know, we can be much smarter in having, if you like, strategic injections of infrastructure and job opportunity in the countryside. And that also the same would also be true in cities, you know, bring more greenery into cities, more productive land into cities. And then as political animals who need access to society and nature, we can all flourish. You know, so this is the kind of vision. I'm an architect. I mean, my instinct is to try and draw this. In fact, next year, I am going to be trying to draw it. So ask me in a year and I'll try and tell you what I've come up with. But, you know, so as I say, it's systemic, it's everything. It's the vision, it's politics, it's the new idea of a good life, it's land reform, it's economic reform, but it's also bringing people with you and saying, hey, you know what? You remember that time under lockdown when you enjoyed doing all of this? We're going to give it to you every day.
Okay, sorry to intervene here, but thanks. Now, of course, you make me very curious how many drawings you've made and have there with you. But I think now is the time to give the floor to Peter de Sutter, who, of course, as member of the European Parliament, is also very involved. Because as we know, with the Green Deal, one of the very important parts of the Green Deal is the farm to fork strategy. So there's also a very interesting debate on farming and food policy actually in European Parliament. So Peter, I'm happy to give you the floor.
Yes, thank you, Dirk. First of all, thank you, Carolyn. You are an historian, you're a philosopher, apparently an architect. It's amazing. It was really a wonderful talk. It was absolutely exciting. I was thinking indeed of giving some remarks from what we've been doing in the European Parliament and what the European Commission has come up with their plans, because I think we are going through some changes, and we all know that the food and agriculture system that you have depicted is actually, we could say, very sick, and it's absolutely not what we as Greens want and picture as the good life that you have so eloquently described with us, linking all these aspects, environment, economy, health. I'm a medical doctor, just want to say that because that's why I'm very interested in the subject. We know that there is a lot of negative impact of our food and agriculture system on climate and environment, and I can give you lots of examples. Of course, the greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and so on, but also all the shipping and transport of food and so on. So this is really impacting the whole issue of climate change, CO2 emissions. Secondly, there's a lot of negative aspects on the social agenda because of the disconnection between the farmers and the food production and the markets. As you've already said, we know that a lot of big agro-industrial companies have monopolies. If I'm well informed, 70% of the global agrochemical industry is in the hands of only 3 companies. And 90% of grain trade is controlled by 4 multinationals. I mean, this is the picture that you showed us, like, you know, the hourglass picture. Yeah, that was very illustrative. So we know these issues, we know the health issues, and I've already pointed to my medical background. We know that a lot of non-communicable diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, are linked with unhealthy diets. And then there is also the effect of chemicals, of pesticides, of endocrine disruptors, which is very important to me personally and linked to our food and agricultural system. But I must say that since the year that we have started in this term in the European Parliament, the European Commission has come with some proposals that are not too bad. We are very critical, and constructive, as Greens always are. And my thought was to go through them very, very quickly with you and just ask your thoughts if you think that this is the right way to go, if you think that we should push further, or that you know, and they have to deliver, of course, it's just plans for the moment, but they have the farm to fork strategy, as Dirk pointed out. They have also a quite good biodiversity strategy, and these are, of course, also linked. Parts of the farm to fork strategy, which we think are quite positive, is the fact that they have the ambition to decrease the usage of pesticides with 50% by 2030. We wanted 80%, of course, but well, already 50%. They have said that at least 25% of all agricultural land should be used for organic farming, which is pretty amazing if you remember the Juncker Commission that we had before. This is, I think, quite progressive, so we're happy with that. And then at least 10% of agricultural land must be used in order to preserve biodiversity, you know, for hedges, flower strips, water storage, and other natural elements, 10%. This is also, we think, a quite positive thing. So in order to make all the food chain sustainable, I mean, that's an ambition in the farm to fork strategy, reducing food waste with 50% by 2030. It's pretty ambitious, I would say. Also working for a European label to make healthy choices possible for consumers in their choices of food products. We think there must, and that's something that we miss in the farm to fork strategy, there should be much more emphasis on the overconsumption and production of meat. This is lacking, and we know why. There's a lot of lobbying, of course, from that side, and Belgium, Flanders is well known as well for its meat production, and mainly exports. This is nothing to do with self-sufficiency. So there's a lot of interest and benefits behind that, so they didn't touch too much on that. And then one of our major criticisms is, of course, that you know, we have this common agricultural policy, which is, of course, very criticized, and which was originally put in place as a protectionist measure for France, of course, to protect the agriculture. It has completely distorted reality. We think that the financial support to farmers should be conditional, and this is not the case at all. And we think that food and agricultural policies should really be linked together, which is what we miss in the approach at the European level. We miss the linkage between several policy domains, because you can say, yes, we will reform agriculture, we will reform food policies, but we don't do anything about trade. Well, then you're missing the point, of course, because you know, also the food that is imported from outside of the EU should uphold the standards that we want within the EU. This is not only for food, of course. And on biodiversity, just a word, because this is so linked with agricultural policies. The biodiversity strategy that was proposed wants to plant 3 billion trees by 2030 in the EU, which is pretty high number, I would say. Protect 30% of land and sea areas by 2030, and 10% with strict protection. Install much more hedges and ponds and other elements to protect nature. Protect rivers for 25,000 additional kilometers compared to today. And I also said that pesticide use should be reduced with 50%. I mean, these are, very ambitious plans. I just want to know if you are able to comment on, do you think this is really revolutionary? Because we've not heard these plans from the European Commission before. So we have been pushing a lot. We've sent letters to Timmermans already months and months ago to influence what would be in these strategies. And a lot of what we ask is in the strategy on paper. Are we going to be naive if we believe that they're serious about this because they have to deliver? How do you see this in view of what you have been telling us about food and agriculture? That would be my sole question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's very, very interesting to hear all of that. And I mean, obviously, it all sounds good to me. Like you, I would like some of the targets to be even more ambitious, but we know we're working with reality. I mean, I think, yes, so the things I've written down while you were talking are, I've written transparent supply chain. Now, I mean, something that came out of, I mean, amazed me actually in the UK 2 days ago, is I read that the government is proposing a new law where basically companies are going to have to prove that deforestation, particularly of you know, tropical rainforest, etc., is not involved at any point in their supply chain. Now, this is the kind of thing we really need to be going towards, and I think that is brilliant. I mean, I'm amazed because I hate the current UK government so passionately that I almost, if they do something good, I just kind of have to triple take it. Anyway, you know, I think, you know, there were two historic things with the EU, and it's very interesting you're talking about the CAP. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me when you look historically at the relationship between Paris and London is precisely that thing that, you know, the sort of protectionism came from such an ancient kind of struggle to feed Paris and so on. And that really, and I think it does genuinely still resonate very strongly in European politics. And of course, as you say, the CAP came out of the Second World War, and the fact that, you know, basically the Allies, one of their massive, massive problems was feeding themselves. And therefore there was this thing, we are never going to be anything other than sort of self-sufficient in food again. And of course, as you rightly say, we can't be self-sufficient in food, or it's a wrong aim, you know. But in fact, one of the diagrams that I didn't show you, which I wish I had, not my diagram actually, but it came out of actually a lecture I gave probably about at least 15 years ago, about von Thunen, you know, the kind of the concentric ring model. And an organic grower in London called Julie Brown saw this, and she said, we need as kind of a modern version of von Thunen to actually look at how a city like London feeds itself now. And she just drew a series of concentric rings, like a kind of, you know, dartboard or something, and basically said, you know, what is grown in London now, what's grown in the region, what's grown in the southeast of England, what's grown in the rest of Europe, and what's grown in the rest of the world, what are the percentages? And then how over time can we move so that those inner rings get bigger and the outer rings shrink? You know, so obviously it's a sort of, it's again, a systemic approach towards being more self-sufficient, I would say, only in the things that our land in Europe wants to grow. You know, so I mean, again, the farming with nature thing, it's very, very important, I think, that we, you know, we have a shift in attitude, and that's why I'm so interested in the Dan Barber, you know, third plate model, which is basically about, you know, look at your landscape and say, what do you want to grow me? And then eat it, you know, which of course is what traditional food cultures are. And this is the irony, is that, you know, by ditching traditional food cultures, we've ditched a lot of ecological wisdom. And again, as I said, you know, in answer to Chris, I think many of the tricks here are to go for something that is naturally pleasurable. You know, so I mean, in terms of the organic farming thing, I mean, we know farmers are very conservative and they hate, you know, they hate being told what to do by idiots who live in cities and all the rest of it, you know. But actually, for example, if you go the other way and sort of say, well, there's an enormous kind of, you know, interest in Europe now in eating more nuts, you know, for example, and we know that, you know, the Californian almond industry is totally screwed. So maybe we could grow more nut trees in Europe. You know, there's a market for them. We can actually market this as something that's already got a very, very eager young audience. Can we encourage farmers to move towards more agroforestry, where, you know, part of what they do involves nut trees, you know, so it's kind of coming from a positive. So saying you can't use chemicals anymore, you know, and it's the same, I think, with all sorts of regenerative farming. You know, I mean, the farmers who are into it in the UK, they're all they are the progressives. They're the very intelligent, very entrepreneurial, actually, but very kind of forward-looking farmers. So if, again, one was to sort of say, well, you know, maybe we move in Belgium away from eating pork sandwiches 3 times a day into eating more nuts, more fruit, and so on. And that is, you know, maybe get some chefs involved in this, you know, get a sort of a movement so that it's seen as something aspirational, and the landscape could look like this. Oh, and by the way, you're not going to have as many pests because you're going to be growing 3 species per acre rather than 1 species per acre. And actually, it's going to cost you less because you're not going to have to pay Monsanto for, you know, well, we're not allowed, luckily, the worst products of Monsanto. But, you know, in other words, you go from the win-win-win side of things. I think you can bring people with you more. So I think transparent supply chain is really important. And as I say, you know, just sort of saying exactly as you say, we're not going to let you be undercut by, you know, by some producer in the rest of the world, but also that's partly because we're going to get much stricter about what food we do import. The meat thing, as I think I've just half addressed, you know, it's actually about going for how healthy and wonderful and actually to do with the landscape a much more plant-based diet can be. I mean, internalizing the cost of food, I think, is also really important. I mean, I think, you know, again, farmers, I mean, most farmers I meet, they don't want to treat animals badly. You know, they don't want to kind of chuck chemicals on the ground, but it's the only way they can see of making a living, given that as Chris pointed out as well, how horribly down at the bottom of the supply chain they are, and they only get 6% of the value of the food. So actually saying, look, we're going to work with you towards shorter supply chains. We're going to work with you towards creating local markets, again, building out of what's already happened with COVID. And we're going to design, I mean, maybe sort of doing some of the thinking for them and sort of say, look, you know, if you get into regenerative farming, if you get into moving from meat-based into plant-based production, we're going to incentivize you and we're going to actually help you build local markets. Then the whole thing feels like a kind of, they're not in it on their own. You know, they're not just over here being dictated to, but you're actually saying, we want to work with you to create the link, the critical link between you and your market is shifting, and we're going to help you shift towards that. And the market wants you to farm with nature. So we're going to sort of, you know, literally have a sort of structured set of possibilities for how you can do that. You know, so I think, you know, the ambition is wonderful. It's fantastic that you're shifting, but as you say, you are moving away from the old mentality of CAP and maximized yields and so on. And one other thing to say is time. You know, stop to say we're moving to a 30-year. I mean, as you say, a lot of the ambitions now are for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ahead. We're going to measure yields over 30 years, not over 3 years, you know. And actually, we're moving towards greater fertility. And that means building soil health. And that means measuring different things, not just what one crop does out of the ground, but what 30 or 40 crops grown in close proximity can do. So it's just shifting mindsets all over the place, basically. But I think you'll find people come with you, and I think enough farmers will come with you. The diehards will start to see which way the money's going and will follow. I hope.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are now into the last.
I mean, you know,
Sorry to interrupt. It's quite hard to moderate a virtual webinar. It's harder than just sitting around the table. I do my best. We are now in the last 5 minutes. So there were also some questions from the public. Luckily, quite some are already being dealt with, like how to look at the question of meat. There's another question. One I want to ask as also last question. It's about food miles. Somebody writes, yes, if you want to still use lemons in your kitchen, you cannot grow lemons in Belgium.
So sorry, yes. I mean, the model I was describing, I don't think I said the most important thing. Of course, we never stop trading globally, of course, you know. But it is about, you know, I mean, it's about not importing green beans from Kenya that have to be grown halfway up a mountainside under artificial light because, you know, they belong in Europe, not in Kenya. Let's carry on buying the coffee from Kenya. And let's, by the way, do it in a much fairer way because it's all completely kind of sewn up by a few companies and none of the locals get a look in. But no, of course, we're going to keep globally trading. but doing it fairly and doing it, I mean, I think, the Europe historically, it doesn't have a great record in terms of trading fairly. There's been a lot of dumping of excess, excess produce, and, we've been seeking to protect our own farmers in the wrong ways. And, I think now is a really, really good time to sort of, part of this new farming revolution is to say, we're going to work a lot more openly and transparently. But of course we want to buy your lemons, and of course we want to buy your coconuts, and that's never going to stop. But to own up to the fact in a way that a lot of it's been, the idea that cheap food should be cheap is just over. That was so 20th century. We're in a neo-geographical age, and nature costs money and food costs money because they're valuable and they're to do with life and continuing life. So it's just a new agenda. It's just a new way of thinking.
I think this kind of last answer really sums up the whole webinar. It's about what is a good life? What do we value in this life? And also reading your book, I was very charmed that you were inspired on the one hand by anarchists that really put an emphasis on personal freedom. I think Greens really like that. You also quote some Marxists that put more emphasis on collective action. And I would say that ecologists combine best of both worlds, freedom and collective action. That's for me the essence of political ecology. So I really want to thank you for this marvelous talk about your book and answering these very simple questions of our Petra, Chris, thank you very much for preparing in short time this webinar. And to the people watching us, before you go, I still have two small things to communicate. First, if you're really into reading more about ecological issues, you should order a free copy of our journal, Oikos. You can find it on our website.
I've been teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, as we say in the UK.
Now you know, Carolyn, why I like you talking about autonomia, because we are doing Oikos every day. And secondly, the Green Party in Flanders, as one of its main topics, has chosen biodiversity this year. Of course, I don't have to explain. It's a topic that's really connected with climate change, health, food, and the party has made a small movie. So as an end, we will show this small movie, and I would say, if you have the chance, go to the library, buy and read this fantastic book. Carolyn, many, many thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you,
great
Carolyn.
Good luck. You're doing great work.
Hoi, ik ben Mieke Schouwvlieger en ik maak deel uit van het toekomstteam biodiversiteit. Dat is een groep groenmandatarissen en medewerkers die hun schouders zetten onder een thema dat super belangrijk is. Goed functionerende ecosystemen zijn zoveel waard. De zuivere lucht die we inademen, gezonde bodems, wilde insecten die planten bestuiven, helder water en nog zoveel meer. We hebben er alle belang bij dat we die ecosystemen beschermen en uitbreiden. Want de biodiversiteitscrisis hangt nauw samen met klimaatverandering, gezondheid, maar ook voedselvoorziening. Daarom staat er de komende maanden heel wat op de groenagenda. In oktober is er de week van bos, waar we actie zullen voeren rond bedreigd waardevol maar zonevrij bos. Tijdens de sessies lokaal, ook op de regiovergadering, gaan we in op biodiversiteit en lokale politiek. Op 10 november organiseert Lotte Stoops en Ingrid Parmentier een colloquium over biodiversiteit. En van 28 mei tot 30 mei organiseert GroenPlus een congres over biodiversiteit. En dat alles richting 15e mondiale biodiversiteitskop. Je hoort het, biodiversiteit is fascinerend. Natuur, maar maakt gelukkig. Misschien deed je al mee aan een van onze 10 bijzondere zomerse zoektochten rond biodiversiteit. Er zijn er 2 per provincie. Ze werden gemaakt door enkele supernatuurliefhebbers en zijn uitstekend geschikt om op ontdekking te gaan naar bijzondere natuurlocaties ergens in Vlaanderen met familie en vrienden. Tot slot, last but not least, ontwikkelden we een burgerwetenschappelijke tool om de natuur dicht bij ons beter in kaart te brengen. Het doel? Meer mensen laten genieten van toegankelijke natuur en strijden voor meer natuur in onze steden en gemeenten. Doe je mee?
Hallo en welkom in ons favoriete bos. Dit is Ayla, mijn Australian Shepherd. En wij zijn hier op Heiderbos.
Ik zit in Brussel en ik wil jullie de Tiny Forest, het eerste Tiny Forest leren kennen van Brussel. Dat is in Vorst. Dat is niet de monocultuur waar ik nu in lig, maar...
Ik ben Vlaams parlementslid en woon in Aalter en ik wil jullie vandaag mijn favoriete plekje natuur in de buurt tonen. Het Hooggoed, een plek waar ik heel veel kom joggen.
Ik sta hier aan de ingang van het Burken. Burken is een natuurgebied beheerd door Natuurpunt vlakbij de plek waar ik woon. Het is duidelijk dat wij natuur nodig hebben, zeker.
Okay.